Hello and welcome to the Bible study section of the Little Church Gathering. This video is for those who are gathered in homes for Little Church, but also anyone who for whatever reason may not be able to get to those gatherings, and so welcome to all of you. We're going to dive into Scripture in a moment, but firstly I just wanted to ask you the question, do you know of anyone who is very kind to people, kind to others, and cares for the poor? Maybe there's someone in your own life, or someone you've heard about or read about, or someone who's passed away that you knew of who was very kind to the poor. Just spend a moment just talking about that with the person next to you or in your small groups. So the person that comes to my mind when I think about someone who cared for the poor a great deal was my friend Don Cameron, who used to work at Cornerstone for many years, Cornerstone in Dandenong, and he cared for people so much. He would go to court with them, he would get them a meal, make sure that they were fed and clothed and housed even, and for many years he did that work, and sadly he passed away only a few years ago at quite a young age. But you know, he's someone that inspired me in a way to care for the poor. So we're going to read a Bible passage now, and the passage today is from Acts chapter 9, verses 32 to 42. So why don't you maybe get someone in your group to read that out loud, and then we'll get into some questions. So here we have the story of Peter miraculously healing a man, Aeneas, and then going to the household of Dorcas and raising her back to life. It's an action-packed story. There's so much in it. And so I wanted you to have a think about, in your groups, what stands out to you in this story? What stands out to you? Well, personally, I'm interested in the fact that this story of Peter parallels a very similar story in the Gospel of Mark when Jesus heals Jairus' daughter. So Jesus was confronted with a crowd of mourners at the household of Jairus, who was a leader of the Jewish synagogue, and these mourners are convinced that death is the final word for this girl, but Jesus asks them to leave, and he commands this girl to get up. He says, "Talitha cum," which means "little girl, get up." He's speaking in Aramaic. And sure enough, she rises up out of her bed and she is alive again. And so Mark points out that Peter, James and John were actually set aside. They were taken. Jesus wanted them to stay with him when he performed this miracle. And so years later, we now see the disciple Peter doing the same thing, basically following in his master's footsteps. There is a bunch of mourners mourning the loss of this girl, Dorcas, and he asks them to leave, perhaps because he wanted them to, they were sort of perhaps lacking in faith. They didn't believe this girl was going to come alive again, and so he kneels down and prays, and then he commands Dorcas to get up, and he would have used the same Aramaic word, cum, and Dorcas rises. And Peter has been shown by Jesus how to pray for healing and how to pray for people coming back from the dead. And so now, without Jesus there, Peter is doing this. But of course, we know that the Spirit of Jesus is with him, and in fact it is Jesus who is doing the healing and bringing back to life, because we read in verse 34, Peter says to Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. So it wasn't Peter doing the work, he was simply an instrument of God, and Jesus was working through him to bring about these incredible miracles. So the next question for today for your group is, who do you identify with most in this story? So there's a number of characters there. There's the mourning widows, there's Dorcas, there's Peter, there's Aeneas, there's also the people in the town of Joppa. So have a think about that for a moment and talk about it with your group. I think I identify mostly with the people of Joppa, who knew Dorcas and knew how kind she was in her acts of service for the poor, and they were just elated, overjoyed to find out that she had come back to life again. And it says in verse 42, the news spread throughout the whole town and many believed in the Lord. When I hear about people who devote their lives to helping others in need, that inspires me in my faith. And equally, I think belief is strengthened when we hear of stories of miracles that have changed people's lives. So the next question for today is, how do the examples of Peter and Dorcas inspire you to live out your faith in this next week? This story inspired me to cross over the road across from the church to Mayfair Lodge, which is a supported residential service. And I knew of someone who had been staying there, but I didn't know, hadn't seen that person for a couple of years, mainly because of the pandemic. And she's a good friend of mine and Catherine's from years ago, but her health has deteriorated. She's had a very tough life, and I'm sure she would have been the sort of person that Dorcas would have responded to and helped. Anyway, I went over there to see how she was, and she was very pleased to see me, and we had a good chat outside, of course, wearing masks. And so the example of Dorcas inspired me to reconnect with this person, but I also prayed for her. She actually asked for prayer, and her boyfriend came as well. He's very unwell, and so I was able to pray for him, and I did so right on the street there on the footpath, and it made me think of how Peter was bold in praying for healing, and had no qualms about doing that in a very public setting. So this week is our final part of the series I entitled Transformed Lives, but I could have equally called it Transformed and Transforming Lives, because if you think about the key people in this story, we've got Peter and Dorcas. They were clearly both transformed by the love and grace of God at work in their lives, but they were also transforming the lives of people around them. Paul Briscoe shared about the life of Peter about 3 weeks ago, and how Peter didn't always get things right, and he failed Jesus a number of times, and yet he ended up becoming a powerful preacher, and, as this story indicates, a healer as well. And then we have Dorcas, who had spent her life in serving others, looking after the poor, making clothes for them, and you can just see how the widows and the whole town, in fact, of Joppa really cared about her so deeply, and they're filled with grief because she had helped so many people with acts of kindness. And as Peter prays for her, the transforming power of God brings about a miraculous recovery, enabling Dorcas to live on and continue her vital work in the town of Joppa. So that concludes our Bible study time, and I hope now you can continue to enjoy worship and fellowship together. God bless.